Alice was known and loved by everyone in her small neighborhood on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. She was an elderly woman with silver hair and a bright, kind smile, and by her side, like an unfailing protector, was Max, a large German shepherd with glossy black fur and a watchful gaze. Max had come into her life years ago when Alice first saw him at a shelter. Thin and frightened, she'd adopted him immediately, and from then on, he'd become part of her life in ways she never could have imagined. "We're a team, aren't we, Max?" she'd say as she stroked his head. Max would look back at her with unwavering loyalty. Alice's morns were calm and comforting. She would leave her house, take Max for a walk through the narrow streets, buy fresh bread from the bakery, and greet neighbors along the way. Max was her constant companion, keeping an eye on her and on everything around them. But that morning, Max's behavior changed. He seemed tense, stopping every few steps to look around and sniff the air. His ears perked up. It was as if he sensed something off. "Max, what's gotten into you today?" Alice asked, patting him on the neck, trying to reassure him. But even with her soft words, Max's alertness didn't ease. He kept tugging her toward home as if he wanted to get her inside as quickly as possible. Alice laughed, thinking maybe he could smell a change in the weather. "All right, let's just grab some bread and head back," she said. As they entered the bakery from inside, she noticed two men standing across the street. They seemed to be talking, but they were watching her intently. Diego and Javier, complete strangers to Alice, had a look that sent a chill down her spine. "It's probably nothing," she thought, trying to push away the strange feeling. Outside, Max was watching them too, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the men. He let out a low growl, sniffing the air. Diego nudged Javier and whispered, "She lives alone, just her and that dog. She seems like an easy target." Javier simply nodded, his eyes following Alice as she stepped out of the bakery, a fresh loaf of bread in hand. As she walked back, Alice noticed Max's uneasiness and felt a growing concern. "What is it, Max? You're acting like you've seen a ghost." She tried to brush it off, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hurrying her steps, she and Max returned home. As she closed and locked the door behind them, she tried to convince herself that everything was fine. But as she looked down at Max, who remained at the door, tense and unyielding, she wondered if her loyal friend knew something she didn't. As they walked home, Alice's sense of unease grew with every step. She could feel Max's tension, his body stiff, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. She tried to ignore it, but the unsettling feeling followed her like a shadow. Once they finally reached home, Alice locked the door and let out a sigh, hoping to shake off the nerves. But Max didn't relax. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on the front door as though expecting something to happen. A low growl rumbled from him, his fur bristling along his spine. Alice could see his behavior was far from normal. "Max, what's gotten into you?" she asked, leaning down to pet him. "I've never seen you act like this." But Max didn't look at her. His focus was on the outside, as if sensing a threat lurking just beyond the door. Outside, hidden in the shadows of the alley across the street, Diego and Javier watched Alice's house closely, their eyes sharp and calculating. Diego wore a dark, smug smile as he spoke in a low voice. "She's alone. Just an old lady with her pet. What kind of trouble could she give us?" he murmured, laughing quietly. "That dog doesn't look very friendly," Javier replied, watching Max silhouette through the window. "But if we get rid of him, the rest is easy." Diego nodded confidently. "We'll come back later tonight when it's quiet. She won't even know what hit her." As fell, Alice tried to settle in with a book in her armchair, but she couldn't shake the memory of the two men watching her. Max wasn't helping. He was pacing near the door, stopping every few minutes to growl softly at any noise from outside, like he was ready for something. "Max, what's going on with you today?" Alice asked, closing her book with a sigh. He walked over to the door trying to listen for anything unusual outside, but all she could hear was the gentle rustling of leaves and the quiet sounds of the night. "There's nothing out there, my friend," she said softly, trying to reassure herself as much as him, but the unease wouldn't leave her, and Max remained steady by the door, his eyes fixed, alert to any sign of movement. As Alice turned off the lights to get ready for bed, she double-checked the windows and door locks. Max's posture made her believe that he knew something was coming, something she hadn't yet understood. Outside, Diego and Javier waited, watching the lights go out one by one. When the house was finally dark, Javier gave a grim smile. "There it is, Diego. All we have to do is wait." Diego's expression hardened, his voice cold and final. "Tonight we're going in. They won't know what hit them inside." Max stayed by the door, his gaze unflinching, as though sensing the real danger that was about to cross the threshold. And though Alice couldn't fully grasp what lay ahead, a voice deep down told her this would be a night unlike any other. The early hours were silent when Alice finally settled in bed, trying to rest, but Max wasn't interested in sleep. He remained in the hallway, his eyes locked on the front door, his fur on edge. The tension in the air was almost tangible, something Alice could feel even if she couldn't explain it. Suddenly, a soft sound came from outside, making Max go rigid, his growl low and dangerous. "Alice, still half asleep," murmured Max. "What is it now?" But before she could stand, she heard a sound that sent chills down her spine, the jiggling of metal against metal, someone tampering with the lock. A loud crash shattered the quiet as the front door was forced open, and Alice let out a scream of pure terror as two masked men, Diego and Javier, charged into her home, their faces hard and menacing. "Stay quiet, Lady," Diego shouted, a cruel smile twisting his face as he advanced toward Alice. "We don't want to hurt you. Just hand over anything valuable." Alice took shaky steps backward, her heart pounding as panic took hold, but Max didn't hesitate. With a ferocious growl, he launched himself at Diego, his jaws clamping down on the man's arm and dragging him to the ground. "That damn dog!" Diego shouted, writhing on the floor as he tried to shake Max off. "Javier, get him off me!" Javier lunged forward to pull Max away, but the dog turned on him with equal fury, forcing him to stumble back. Alice, frozen with terror, watched the desperate fight. Max was relentless, attacking with a fierce determination to protect her. "This dog's going to kill us," Javier yelled, pulling out a knife and aiming it at Max. "I'm going to put an end to this." But Max, driven by a fierce instinct to protect, didn't back down. He leaped again, biting Javier's arm and sending him reeling. Diego scrambled to his feet, trying to push past Max and get to Alice, but Max blocked his path, standing firm with his teeth. His growl filling the room, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and fear. Alice grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it at Diego, hitting him hard enough to make him stumble. Realizing they were no match for Max and Alice's resistance, the two men exchanged panicked glances. "Let's get out of here, Diego. This dog's going to rip us apart," Javier shouted, clutching his injured arm as he backed toward the door. Diego, humiliated and furious, glared at Alice one last time, his eyes full of hatred. "This isn't over, old lady. We'll be back." With that, he and Javier fled into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Silence filled the house once more. Trembling, Alice knelt beside Max, who was panting heavily but still watching the door, as if expecting them to return at any moment. "Oh, Max, you saved me," she whispered, her hands shaking as she stroked her loyal friend's fur. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Max, exhausted, lay down beside her, his body still tense, his eyes vigilant. That night, Alice realized Max was far more than just a companion. He was her true guardian. The next morning dawned quietly, but Alice's heart was still racing. The memory of the break-in felt like a nightmare, yet the broken door and the bruises on her hands reminded her it had been real. In the kitchen, Max rested, but even in his Exhaustion, his ears stayed alert, his gaze focused, ready to react to any suspicious sound. After drinking a cup of coffee to steady her nerves, Alice picked up the phone and called the police. Her voice shook as she described the two men and the terrifying attack that Max had so bravely fought off. Two officers arrived shortly after to take her statement. Max sat beside her, watching them closely, distrustful of any unfamiliar face or movement. Officer Philip, a kind-faced man, listened carefully, and once Alice finished, gave Max an approving look. "This dog is a true hero," he said, kneeling to pet Max. "Not many dogs would fight like this to protect someone." Alice, feeling a surge of pride, stroked Max's fur, her hand gentle but firm. "He's more than a hero," she replied with a small, heartfelt smile. "He's my family." The second officer, however, adopted a more serious tone. "We understand that your dog acted bravely, Mom, but those men may come back. They know you live alone, and that might encourage them to try again. We recommend adding more locks and, if possible, installing an alarm system." Alice nodded, a mix of worry and relief in her expression. "I'll do whatever it takes. I need to feel safe again." In the following days, Alice took every precaution. She hired a technician to reinforce her locks and install a security alarm each time the doorbell rang. She felt a tightness in her chest, an ever-present alertness that wouldn't allow her to fully relax. Max, for his part, seemed to feel the same way. He continued patrolling the house, moving from room to room, and each time he heard a sound or saw movement outside, he would pause and let out a low growl. Alice watched her loyal friend, sensing that he knew the danger wasn't entirely gone. Meanwhile, in a distant alley, Diego and Javier were nursing their bruises and discussing the failed attempt. Diego, his arm still bandaged and his face twisted in anger, looked over at Javier, who wore a similarly grim expression. "That dog ruined everything," Diego spat, gritting his teeth. "Who would have thought he'd be so aggressive? He's just a dog, he's not invincible," Javier replied, rubbing his injured shoulder. "Next time we'll be ready. We won't let him get in our way again." Diego's eyes hardened as he looked at his partner, his voice cold and determined. "Exactly, this time we go in and deal with him first. The old lady won't stand a chance." That night, Alice finished tidying up the kitchen, but an uneasy feeling lingered. Max, as if sensing her thoughts, stood by her side, his eyes fixed on the door, a low growl rumbling from his chest. She knelt beside him, gently scratching his neck, trying to reassure them both. "It'll be okay, Max. We're prepared now, and they won't come back, right?" Max, his dark eyes intense and unwavering, seemed to be saying that if they did return, he would be there to protect her, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Alice knew that Max's presence was her only source of courage for whatever might come next. The cold, silent early hours of the morning settled over Buenos Aires as Alice tried to find finally rest, though an unease lingered. Max, as he had done every night, stayed in the hallway, his eyes locked on the front door, his body tense. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling Alice sensed even if she couldn't fully understand it. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise outside, a quiet shuffle that made Max go rigid, his growl low and menacing. Half asleep, Alice murmured, "Max, what is it now?" But before she could stand, a sound sent a wave of fear through her, the sharp clinking of metal as someone fumbled with the lock. A loud crash shattered the quiet as the front door was forced open, and Alice's scream filled the room as Diego and Javier stormed in, their expressions cold and determined. "Playtime's over, old lady," Diego shouted, gripping a metal rod in his hand. "Did you really think we'd give up so easily?" Alice took a step back, heart racing. "Please leave. I called the police last time. You'll regret this." Javier just laughed, pulling out a knife as he moved toward her slowly. "Not this time. We're not leaving empty-handed." Without hesitation, Max launched himself at Diego, his fierce growl filling the room. He clamped down on Diego's arm, knocking him to the ground. Alice, terrified, watched as Max fought bravely, her mind racing for a way out, but her worry for Max left her frozen in place. The damned dog, Diego screamed, writhing on the floor as he tried to shake Max off. Javier do something. Javier, holding the knife, tried to strike Max, but the dog, moving quickly, dodged the blade and lunged at him, pushing him back against the wall. Max was relentless, his only focus to protect Alice at any cost. Seeing a chance, Alice grabbed the phone and dialed the police, her voice trembling as she cried, "Please, come quickly, they're here, they're trying to hurt me." She looked back at Max, who continued to fight with every ounce of strength he had. Javier, now panicked and bleeding, yelled, "Diego, let's get out of here, this dog is going to kill us." But Diego, furious and desperate, charged forward with the metal rod. Before he could strike, Max lunged again, knocking him down and disarming him for good. Red and blue lights began flashing outside as the police arrived, realizing time was up. Diego and Javier tried to flee, but the officers stormed in, weapons drawn, ordering them to the ground. One of the officers rushed to Alice, who was kneeling beside Max, sobbing with relief and gratitude. "It's okay now, Mom. Thanks to this dog, we were able to catch them." Alice, still shaking, stroked Max's fur, her hands trembling. "You're my hero, Max. My hero," she whispered, her voice full of emotion as she held her loyal companion close. When morning finally arrived, sunlight streamed through Alice's house, illuminating the marks left by this struggle, but bringing a sense of peace and safety she hadn't felt in a long time. The nightmare was over. The police had taken Diego and Javier into custody, and Alice knew that Max, with his bravery and loyalty, had secured her safety. As she gently petted Max, tears welled in her eyes. He was exhausted with a few scratches, but he watched her with that same protective gaze. At that moment, she realized that no words would ever be enough to express her gratitude. Later, 2 officers returned to take her full statement and check on her well-being. Seeing Max, Officer Philip, who had been following the case from the start, approached with a look of admiration. "Miss Alice, we'd like you to bring Max to the station. Our chief wants to recognize what he did. He deserves a medal for bravery." Alice looked at Max, tears of pride filling her eyes as she gently touched his head. "A medal? You deserve the world, my friend," she whispered, smiling warmly. That afternoon, Alice brought Max to the station, where the officers had arranged a small ceremony in his honor. Police officers and some neighbors who had heard about the incident gathered to see the hero dog who had saved his owner from a terrible fate. The police chief placed a gleaming medal around Max's neck and addressed everyone present. "This dog is not just a hero to his owner, he's an example of courage and loyalty to all of us. On behalf of our community, we thank him for his brave actions." Alice, holding back tears, watched with pride as Max received the recognition he so deserved. Applause filled the room, and Max, always serious, stepped beside her like a true guardian. That night back home, Alice prepared a special dinner for Max, a hearty, delicious meal worthy of a hero. While he ate, she sat in her old armchair, watching him and reflecting on everything they had been through together. Max was more than just a dog. He was her strength, her support, her courage. Several neighbors stopped by to offer words of comfort and appreciation, including Mrs. Clara, who brought a homemade cake and a bottle of wine. "Alice, we all know what Max did for you. He's not just your hero now, he's a hero to all of us." Alice smiled, deeply moved. "Yes, Max is special. He always has been. Now he's the protector of all of us." When night fell, Alice and Max settled together on the porch under a starry sky. Max, still wearing the shiny medal around his neck, rested his head on her lap. Finally at peace, she stroked his fur, feeling safe, protected, and overwhelmingly grateful. "My dear Max," Alice whispered, "you're more than a hero. You're my family, my friend, and I know that with you by my side, nothing will ever shake us." Under the quiet night sky, as a gentle breeze drifted by Alice and Max sat in silence, enjoying their well-earned peace with the certainty that together they were unstoppable.